Hi everybody, good afternoon. Welcome back to the afternoon session of the Enforcement Summit 2021. My name's Chris Naylor and I'm the Membership and Operations Manager at the International Parking Community. We've got a really interesting session this afternoon on solving pressure points. So we're going to be focusing on dealing with vulnerable debtors. We're going to look at training and skills development, fraud investigations, managing representations and appeals, camera enforcement and parking on private land. The morning session I found really interesting, really informative, and so hopefully you'll find the same with this afternoon session. We've got a number of sessions that are going to be happening. So we're looking at debt recovery during and after lockdowns with Russell Hamblin-Boone from CIVEA. We're looking at dealing with vulnerable debtors, a local authority perspective from David Glenister at the London Borough of Camden. We'll then be moving on to dealing with vulnerable debtors, civil enforcement agency approaches from Helen Addis at Bristow and Sutor. We will then be moving on to quality assurance and enforcement training, and that's going to be Steve Penney from Marston Holdings. Then we'll move on to detecting and deterring blue badge fraud from Paul Slowey, who's at BBFI. And then finally, it will be ANPR vehicles, Jonathan Hector from Videalert. So I think with any further ado, just one thing to remember is if you could please drop any questions that you may have into the comments box. Feel free to drop them in at any point. I will happily kind of take notes on the questions, so don't feel like you have to wait until the question and answer session at the end once everybody's spoken. So I think that's a bit from me at the start, so we might as well move straight into our first session, which is Russell Hamblin-Boone, who's the Chief Executive Officer of CIVEA, who's going to be speaking about debt recovery during and after the lockdowns.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so
got that, Russell.
That's great, thanks. Covering two topics, so quite a lot to cram into the short time that we've got, but I want to look at how the industry has been affected by COVID, how it responded to it, and then some of the subsequent reforms that have come out of that. So it's kind of the positive of what is a very negative circumstance in COVID. So just for anyone who doesn't know, as an introduction, CIVEA is the principal trade association, and we represent firms that employ enforcement agents in England and Wales. That's about 95+% of the entire civil enforcement industry. There are 17 to 1800 operating certificated enforcement agents, and the industry collectively under CIVEA is made up of 39 firms. So when we look at pre-COVID, we were already on a path of improvement and introducing reforms to our industry, and the combined impact of new regulations and CIVEA's own voluntary code, which I'll talk a bit more about later, was evidenced in the amount of early engagement that firms were having with debtors, and obviously therefore reducing the fees that they were incurring. And the outcomes of the new regulations, the outcomes of the efforts that firms were making, was clearly being seen in things like fewer doorstep visits, getting fewer complaints. The work that was going on to understand more about vulnerability and to make sure enforcement agents were trained in identifying vulnerability. The new regulations introduced externally verified training and certification for enforcement agents, and perhaps most importantly, the huge investment firms made in technology, especially at the compliance stage of the process. And then COVID hit, and things were stalled, and as an industry, we recognised the need to be proactive, and we needed to act collectively to ensure that standards continue to be maintained in these unprecedented circumstances. So the first thing the firms did was agreed that they would voluntarily suspend enforcement visits, which in fact was a month ahead of the government's statutory ban, which came in April. And they continued to work with their clients. Some clients wanted firms to maintain skeleton contact centres so that they could continue to maintain a light touch contact with debtors and provide a way for people to continue to make payments. But there were no enforcement agent visits, and firms furloughed their staff and gave them support to volunteer as essential workers and play their part in supporting the communities that were, being affected by the pandemic. And so it was also really important for us to show leadership about what would happen when the COVID restrictions were lifted, when councils needed to start looking at their budgets and the holes in their budgets from all of the costs they'd incurred as a result of the pandemic, and for the industry to be able to offer some reassurance and confidence to their local authority clients, but also to central government, to the Ministry of Justice, that we could go back to work and that we could do it safely, protecting both our enforcement agents and also the members of the public. And we came up with the post-lockdown support plan. And this was a huge effort to implement and ensure that enforcement agents could return to work safely, that they could protect the public, and we could get the support of government to be able to do this and for them to lift some of the restrictions on us. And the plan was in three parts. The first part was to do some kind of pre-engagement with people, not necessarily collecting debt, but just reaching out to them, finding out whether their circumstances have changed, whether you're through redundancy or ill health or any kind of family change in circumstances, reminding them that they still had a debt to pay and that we would be making contact, and when it was appropriate, we would be visiting if necessary. And also looking to see whether there was any vulnerability that we needed to be aware of in order to adjust our approach to the collection. And that attempt at early engagement helped to prevent additional fees being added to the outstanding debt. The visit process we also changed. It was we made sure that the visits would be contactless. We maintained our commitment of no entry to residential properties, and that where we identified vulnerability, enforcement agents would withdraw and report the circumstances back. And all of this was backed up by a training program that was a bespoke program designed by one of our members, Cedar Group, who very graciously provided it to all of our firms free of charge through an online portal. And that looked at things like safe working practices for enforcement agents, training on vulnerability and on risk assessment. And the video was rolled out over a 10-week period, and we were able to train 1,700 agents, and no agents were able to go back out into the field until they'd completed the full training program, which was a huge success for us and gave that confidence to the government that we were acting proactively and that we were doing the right things in the right way. And the training program covered a lot of detail, but some of the things it looked at was how you could visit properties and continue to social distance from people that you were meeting, making sure that enforcement agents were monitoring their own symptoms, and there was a reporting process if they felt that there were if they had any symptoms and needed any kind of support from their firms. There was training on the use of PPE, how to sanitize vehicles, how to sanitize equipment like wheel clamps, how to make sure in between visits that the correct procedures were taken for following the government's health and safety guidance, and then right the way through to how to make contactless payments, how to use lifts safely, a huge amount of detail to make sure that enforcement agents knew how to act in all different circumstances to maintain safety and ensure that we were complying with the government's requirements, which was critical to ensure that we continue to be able to operate. And as a result of all of this work, enforcement agents were back in the field in August 2020, which was a huge achievement when many other sectors were still prevented from working at that time. We maintained close dialogue with the Ministry of Justice, and they required us to report information on how the enforcement visits were going under the new COVID restrictions. And it's been such a success that obviously now the restrictions have been lifted, and enforcement agents can, if they want to, enter people's homes. It's not happening so much at the moment, but they still have to follow all of the guidance that we put in place around protecting themselves and protecting the public. And so although we had a slight hiatus in the reforms that we were introducing that I talked about earlier, actually the COVID crisis has led to an escalation of those reforms, and we've been able to move forward more quickly. Perhaps we've had more opportunity to focus, but also recognizing the need to adapt to the post-COVID enforcement world. So as well as the enhanced code of conduct, which was launched in September 2019, we'd introduced the mandatory use of body-worn video cameras as a voluntary commitment by CIVEA members. We'd introduced a code compliance audit visit process and an independent panel to review complaints. And then at the end of last year, the Centre for Social Justice, a right-wing think tank, produced a report called Collecting Dust, which was quite critical of local authorities and the enforcement sector, particularly around council tax. And at the same time, CIVEA had been developing plans for an enforcement commission, which was to be an oversight body for the industry. So we went to the Centre for Social Justice and said, we've seen your report. Actually, we might have a response to it in our proposals for an enforcement commission. And the Centre for Social Justice decided to set up a working group that was composed half industry and half of the debt advice sector to draw up plans for what then became renamed the Enforcement Conduct Authority. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this really sort of groundbreaking initiative that has brought together the industry, the debt advice sector to plan what will effectively be an entirely new self-regulatory body for the industry. The Enforcement Conduct Authority, the ECA, objectives will obviously be raising standards in the industry, but also firms will be accountable now to an independent body. That body will also be able to look at complaints where they've been escalated, where people are unsatisfied with the responses by firms, and it will also be looking to understand how vulnerability and fairness can be built into the enforcement process, given the context of local government and central government debt collection. There will be the powers to authorise the firms. So what we'll be looking to do is encourage as many firms as possible to sign up to be supervised by the Enforcement Conduct Authority. We're already having conversations with the BPA, with the High Court Enforcement Officers Association and the CIVEA. So there's a lot of support for this independent body. And we would like that local authorities, in the same way as they require firms to be part of a trade association when they're negotiating contracts, that they would require them to be part of the Enforcement Conduct Authority. And then there's a longer term ambition to see whether this body needs to have some sort of legislative statutory underpinning. Clearly, it's important that this body has the powers to look at the rules and the standards that the industry works to ensure that they're still fit for purpose. And I think the national standards introduced in 2014 probably are not, and therefore one of its priorities will be to review the national standards. It will look at how vulnerability is defined and managed in other business sectors and draw up some guidance specific for the enforcement sector. And it will look at this thorny issue of affordable repayments, given the parameters that revenue teams work within, which is very different to those levers that the commercial creditors have. And we would like that these standards and these rules will be built into future service level agreements with firms. There'll be supervision and monitoring of the firms, as well as being able to make site visits and conduct audits against the standards. The ECA will also receive data and information on a regular basis to be able to monitor performance of firms and the conduct of agents. It will be able to do random checking and also commission research where it feels there may be issues that need to be investigated further to ensure there are no systemic problems. It will oversee complaints where they've been escalated and try to implement a more consistent complaints process with a simplified two-stage approach where anyone complaining knows that there's a clear timetable with deadlines by which the firms need to respond, and also to receive information from enforcement agents who self-declare when there's been an EAC2 complaint against them, so that through the complaints process they can have a clear understanding of where the problems may lie and actually have a truer picture of any systemic problems in the industry. And it's really important that the ECA has teeth, so it will have the powers to impose sanctions on firms. The ECA itself will need to draw up the policy for this, but we propose that they are tariff-based sanctions where the polluter pays according to the significance of the breach. It's important that the deterrents are strong enough to ensure compliance, and there will be an appeals process for firms to be able to challenge any sanctions. So the next steps for the ECA is the approval of a framework document drawn up by the working group of the debt advice sector in the industry, and pretty much this week that's been approved. There'll be a process for appointing a CEO and a supporting board. That's already starting to get into train. We've continued to engage with the government throughout this process, and in the House of Lords last month, the government minister said that they supported the principle of the Enforcement Conduct Authority, that they would monitor it for a 2-year period, and if they felt there needed to be intervention, statutory underpinning, or any kind of legislative change, then they would look at that and intervene earlier if necessary. So the Enforcement Conduct Authority is going to be officially announced by the Centre for Social Justice in a report that it's publishing between now and the end of July, and that will be the first public recognition, hopefully with ministerial support, of this new body to oversee the industry under a new self-regulatory body, which we look forward to hearing more about the detail once the CEO and the chair and the board are in place. So I'll leave the final words to the ministers themselves. This is just comment from the Paymaster General in the Cabinet Office and the Minister for Justice, both recognising the huge efforts the industry has made to act proactively, to act practically, and to act safely through COVID, and then out the other side with these exciting reforms that I'm pleased to be able to tell you about. So I think we're taking questions at the end, so I'll wait for the panel session, but please do put things in the chat box if you've got any questions. So over to you, Chris.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Russell. I found that incredibly informative. There's an awful lot of stuff has obviously gone on through the pandemic, and the ECA sound like it's going to be something that's going to bring about positive change. So moving on, we are now looking at dealing with vulnerable debtors, a local authority perspective from David Glenister, who's a parking investigations officer at the London Borough Camden. So over to you, David. David, we've not got any sound there. No, can't hear you at all, unfortunately.
Is that better?
Yes, absolutely. Got you now.
Oh, brilliant. Hi, my name's David. I work for the parking investigations team for Camden Council. So it's a job we've been doing for quite a few years now. I found that when I started the job, really our focus was on trying to get revenue. It was all about any initiatives for how can we get revenue in. So it was like, how, can we use technology to get revenue? How can we trace debtors better to get revenue in? Even things like trying to do any sort of cross services. So we'd look at things like, if we've got a persistent evader, how can we, maybe stop them having a permit or something like that to try and encourage them to pay any debts they've got with us. But I think there's definitely been a change I've found in the last few years from initiatives being to do with how we get debt to really looking at how we can deal with vulnerable debtors and possibly look at why people have got into debt and help them out. We really want to work with the debtors in helping solve things, not against them. I think is the best way I can put the change in the last few years. And I think that's probably a change that reflects society as a whole. I think the way we now look at maybe mental health issues and how mental health issues can probably, be so difficult and complicated and affect people's lives in so many ways. And one of the ways is when people get into debt. So I think probably what we've done is, as a council, I think we're quite forward thinking. We're very much interested in equality, in treating everyone fairly. So what we've really done is try to look at ways in which, this sort of like incorporates into that, I think, as a council, the way maybe we want to try and treat people and look at kind of like reflecting in many ways how society has changed and looking at how people do get into debt, any issues that they might have, and really trying to help them solve it and work with them. I think as well, it's kind of linked as well to how the economy is as well these days. We saw like maybe with the financial crash recently, obviously with the pandemic as well, that, the economy, people kind of can get into debt very quickly. They can lose their job. They've got a lot of outgoings, and it's linked to that as well. So I think what we've been doing is initiatives definitely for our council. I feel in my time in the job has changed from going from pursuing debt and trying to get revenue, really to just trying to work with people, if they're vulnerable and identifying vulnerable debtors and such like that. So I thought what I'd do today is just talk about a few initiatives that we've had. Obviously, it's initiatives Camden might have started, or their initiatives started with our enforcement agents. And obviously, we can't really do it alone. We do rely on the support of any contractors we have, like enforcement agents. We are working successfully with them for these initiatives to help vulnerable debtors. So I'm going to just give you a few examples today of what I've experienced working with vulnerable debtors and any initiatives that we've had. It's just kind of like a personal perspective, really. I mean, my job as parking investigations officer, I'm the one kind of on the phones, I'm the one who acts an intermediate, things like that. So this is more like how I feel that they've worked. And I think what you'll see is a theme, I think maybe Russell touched on it in his talk before, his presentation, is really how it's incorporating wider issues. I think for us, it's about how, the initial contact possibly of the parking fine can help lead to wider issues that we can help people for. So I'm just going to go through a few of the initiatives. So if I could just have the next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing we did was Camden's Debt Clinic. This was an initiative we set up pre-pandemic a few years ago. So what this was where we had Camden premises, where we had a space where debtors could visit the council and speak face-to-face about any issues they were facing. So we worked with the contractors, our enforcement agents, we drew up a list of where debtors lived if they were in a commutable distance of Camden. And we contacted the debtors to invite them to come to one of the debt clinics, which we put on once a month to talk about debt. A lot of time in my job, I have to work with people, speak to people on the telephone. And I do find a lot of the time people either they find it very difficult if we say to people, you know, if you could write in and explain your situation, they often find it very difficult to write, you know, to express themselves writing in, and they're reluctant to do it. Even on the telephone, I think some people get very nervous on the telephone. They find it quite difficult to say exactly what they want to say. Maybe they've been waiting in the queue for 20 minutes. They're not in the best mood. They can't see someone. They, you know, it's a lot of how, you know, they want to express themselves. It's probably through their body language. So we find that actually people sometimes just want to speak face to face. And one of the reasons we set up the initiatives is people on the phone would say, can I just not come in and speak to someone? It'd be so much better if I could just speak to somebody. So we did feel like a face to face is very good for some people. Sometimes as well, like we've seen that people get into debt for so many reasons that can be so complicated. And it's sometimes better for them to be able to just sit down with us with a pen and paper and say, this is what's happened, what can we do, and stuff like that. And we did find that the sessions were a great success. One of the things that I think I'd like to concentrate on, probably for all the initiatives, is how it's like able to use this data that we've got from enforcement agents and look at ways in which that kind of can go across everything, you know, about other issues and how we can help people. So some of the examples would be, for example, we could signpost debtors who possibly maybe have addictions to services available within the borough. So that's something we could identify. They maybe have got into debt because of that. And then we can hopefully signpost them to any services that could help them with that. We can also liaise with other local authorities to provide assistance. So I'm sure any enforcement agents will be able to tell you, sometimes when people get into a lot of debt, it's not just with one borough, it's usually with neighbouring boroughs as well. We have people who tell us they're in debt, not just with Camden, but it could be with Westminster, Barnet as well. So it's a way of just getting someone there, you know, because we don't share as much data possibly between boroughs. We don't really speak to each other direct. It was at least a way of amalgamating everything and giving people numbers and contacts and everything like that to do. It's also not just other boroughs, it's within services as well, that sometimes if someone's in debt for a parking fine, they might be possibly in arrears with their council tax, with their rent, anything else. So it was to be able to provide assistance that were maybe non-parking related issues. Someone might say, well, I can't use your website, can you just show me? And we could be there and say, okay, let's have a look, what did you want to do? And things like that. So that was quite good as well. It was also as well, I mean, we use as a borough 3 different enforcement agents, and sometimes people can get debts with different agents for whatever reason. It could be through a different borough. It could be that they had older tickets with one agent and they've possibly gone to another, even though we like to use just one, but that can sometimes happen. So it's really about maybe like coordinating enforcement agents as well on behalf of the debtors. Sometimes if someone's kind of, you know, someone can just get snowed under, I think. And when you get into debt, other things can happen and you get suddenly, it just seems too much. So for us to be there and be able to say, okay, well, we can help you contact all the different enforcement agents, that was quite good as well. It was also about building trust and relationships with members of the public. We did find doing these sessions, people were like saying, oh, actually, I was quite worried coming in, or I had an idea of how I think debt recovery is in Camden, and that's changed now. So it did help build relationships and things like that. So that was the first thing we did, which was pre-pandemic. Obviously, with the pandemic, we had to stop doing that. We're all working from home. We couldn't do face-to-face anymore. But we obviously want to carry on initiatives. Obviously, during the pandemic, probably more than ever, people, you know, are going to be vulnerable. You know, we've all seen news stories about the effects the pandemic's had on the economy, and probably all of us here have experienced some effects of lockdown over the past 18 months. So obviously there was more initiatives we thought we could still take on. So if I could just have the next slide, please. Okay, so the next thing we did was this vulnerable debtor initiative. which was an initiative with contractors, the enforcement agents. We wanted to speak with their welfare teams direct and deal direct. So what we've done is each week we've asked the welfare team for our enforcement agents to send us a list of any debtors that they've identified as being vulnerable. We then worked with the welfare team, the client team, to see how best to deal with that individual. So this could be that we get an individual and we look at the case and say, you know what, in our opinion, we should have the warrant returned, or we'd like you to put the warrant on hold while we request further information, or we could even extend the period for a hold, possibly get in touch with the debtor about what is available to them and things like that as well from a council point of view. So I think one of the advantages this has been for us is with a council, a lot of the time, we let things progress. And in the past, there was a tendency to say, okay, we've tried to do everything we can. Let's give it to the enforcement agents now and let things progress. And you could have a case where you've got 3 tickets go to a warrant, but there's another 6 or 7 at PCN stage that we've still got. The enforcement agent might do a lot of work and decide there's not much they can do with that debt and return it. But we'd still have these tickets that keep going through the system, and it creates, it costs £8 each time we file at Traffic Enforcement Centre for an NODR. It's giving work to bailiffs that maybe they can't, the enforcement agent, it gives them work that maybe they can't pursue. It's not giving them quality cases, it's just quantity. So by identifying vulnerable debtors, we're able to then look back at other cases they may have and related cases and see if there's anything we can look at there. It could be that if we're going to be cancelling a debt because it's a vulnerable debtor, we won't get the money, we can cancel all the other tickets before they progress. So I think that's one of the things that we wanted to do, was be able to identify maybe debt that nothing will happen, that we need to kind of write off. And we can do that in a much earlier stage. So that was one of the advantages doing it. Another one, which is kind of in theme, which I was speaking about probably through the presentation, is how we can help people and across the service. So a couple of examples I've got was having someone who the welfare team, the enforcement agency welfare team, identified as a vulnerable debtor. They were undergoing chemotherapy. And we put a note on the case to say what was happening. It was identified as a vulnerable debtor. We then had another team, our parking operations team, who deals with on-street enforcement. The car of the vulnerable debtor was parked in a suspended bay, and they saw the note that it was a possible vulnerable debtor. So rather than remove the car, they gave me a call to say, what do you want to do? And what we were able to do is speak to the enforcement agent, get a phone number for the vulnerable debtor and actually speak to him. And before we removed the vehicle, we were able to say, look, your vehicle's parked, it could get removed. And he was actually that day undergoing a chemotherapy session. So it would have not been very good for anyone had that car been removed to the car pound. He was able to get his car moved. And, that was probably the best result. So I think that was a really good example of how we'd identified, the welfare team had identified this person as a vulnerable debtor. And we're able to use that information to speak to them and not get their car removed and deal with the problem. So it's things like that. And other things are things like we can see, if we see a vulnerable debtor, we can look at other tickets and say, okay, then it looks like they're not using their blue disabled badge properly. They keep getting the ticket in the same place for the same reason. And again, we can just contact them and say, okay, then you need to, let's try and get sorted out, get you a new badge if it's expired, give you some more information where to park and things like that. So we have found that pretty good as well. That's been really helpful to get the information from the enforcement agents and then use that really to help. It's like seeing each debtor as an individual. So that has been quite a successful scheme. So I could just have the last slide, please. The next slide, thanks. Okay, so the next initiative is probably the most recent one, which is the Breathing Space Initiative. So this is a new government scheme to help people deal with their debts. So the nature of this scheme means that we have to have really good communication through many different parties, through debt charities, debt offices, things like that, and the enforcement agents and the council. And so it's kind of all about the communication. We have found a few teething problems with it, not necessarily with the enforcement agents or us. It's been more debt charities who've been a little slow to respond, but we have been putting resources in place, and we're finding that the enforcement agents have been really supportive of us to mitigate any issues we might have had in a delay in getting responses from the any third-party charity, debt relief charities. We've actually found the take of this hasn't been as high as anticipated. We were, when the scheme was initially spoke about and brought in, were a bit concerned how many resources we'd need. But it is an initiative we've embraced and we're taking very seriously. And we have a dedicated source and processes to see if the take-up, if the take-up continues and stuff like that. We're kind of in place to have it deal with it as the best way we can. So that is an initiative. I haven't got as many examples of that simply because it's quite new, and the take-up hasn't, for our council, been as high as we anticipated. But we think probably going forward is going to become probably one of the main initiatives. Okay, if I could just have the final slide, please. Okay, I just wanted to say one final thing. It's not really an example, but as I say, I've been in the team for quite a few years. And I think one of the really good things and one of the positive things is what a good relationship we do have with all our enforcement agencies. The three we use, the ones we've used in the past, it's really good. It really makes the job so much easier and so much better. That we're a phone call away from the client web and the client teams and the back office. And I think this definitely helps with the shift towards the focus on vulnerable debtors, having this really good relationship. There's so many occasions I can think where, say, a vehicle's been clamped and the debtor calls us up and gives us information that only we'd know in that phone call. There's no way enforcement agents could have known or we'd known previously, possibly that they've got a hospital appointment, that there's something on the phone that gives an indication that it's going to be best to get the vehicle unclamped. And I've had many occasions where I've had to make the decision to request a vehicle is unclamped for no charge or a reduced charge. And I always find that the client, the telephone operators who I speak to in the back office are always so helpful, so understanding. We're always from the same page. They can see why we want to do what we want to do. And they always manage to get the cars unclamped as quick as they can. So we, all the time, not just in phone calls, but with emails, monthly meetings, we find the enforcement agents we use are so good, and even some of the enforcement agents on street, they phone us up and we know them first name and stuff like that and help them out. And I think that relationship's really good. So yeah, that's all I've got to say, really. It was just really quite an informal chat just on the way I find how, we deal with people on the front line. And I think it is quite nice when we do hear sometimes the theory, if that makes sense. There are a lot of presentations about the theory, but it's quite nice to just speak about how it can happen in practical terms and how any legislation does apply in practical terms. So thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, David. Again, really informative. It kind of leads really nicely into our next presentation, which is it's again on dealing with vulnerable debtors, but this time it's looking from a civil enforcement agency and how they would approach it. So this is Helen Addis, who's the Social Responsibility and Welfare Manager at Bristow and Sutor.
Thanks, Chris. So what I'm going to say very much leads on from what we've just heard. And a lot of the points are going to echo what David's been saying, which is really positive to see that there is quite a lot of crossover between the ways we're thinking about things and the ways that local authorities are thinking about things. So just very quickly, I'm going to start off by introducing the company that I work for, which is Bristow and Sutor. We're an enforcement agency working on behalf of local government clients across England and Wales, collecting council tax arrears, MDR arrears, penalty charge notices, and other sundry debts, plus PCN debts for Transport for London. As you can see from the map, our clients cover a good spread of the country, and as David said, we also think that strong relationships with our clients are super important. So we have well-established relationships with the majority of our clients. All our enforcement agents are directly employed by us, which is a different model to other enforcement agencies, but it has a couple of really important benefits. Firstly, they're paid a steady salary and are not reliant on always collecting payment in full, whereas contracted agents might be. Also, they're directly under our supervision and control, which means we know they're always properly trained and kept up to date with all changes to policies and process, and their performance is regularly reviewed. Bristow and Sutor also have dedicated teams to address vulnerability and safeguarding concerns, and we're going to address that in more detail later, but what it basically means is that whether we're dealing with someone over the phone or face-to-face on a visit, there's a team in the background that's ready to take over the case if needed. We're governed by the CIVEA Code of Practice, which you've already heard a little bit about, and that means we adhere to a compliance framework exceeding the statutory requirements and national standards for enforcement agencies. And finally, we're active participants with the Money Advice Liaison Group to make sure that we stay in touch with the advice sector. And again, I'm going to talk a bit more about that in just a moment. So firstly, I wanted to look at why vulnerability matters in parking enforcement. David touched on this, that it's a key topic over the last few years. In my experience, it's something that we speak about quite a lot more often with relation to council tax than PCNs. And in some ways that can seem really obvious. So council tax is a priority debt and something we all have to pay, whereas a PCN debt can be avoided through responsible road use. However, vulnerability does have an impact on PCN collection, and it's something we have to consider seriously when we're enforcing those debts. It's also important to understand that while a person who owns a car might be seen to be at least somewhat financially stable, there's a number of ways that vulnerability might impact somebody's ability to pay beyond their financial means to meet the value of the debt. So vulnerability can take a number of forms, including difficulties with communication, for example, language difficulties. It could be a life event that has temporarily caused disruption to their circumstances, like a sudden bereavement. It could be a physical or mental health condition that relapses and remits, causing breaks in communication. There are myriad forms of, sorry, just clicked a bit quickly there. There are myriad forms of vulnerability that may need to be considered, but they don't mean we can't or shouldn't collect the debt. Rather, they mean that the way the debt is collected might need to be adjusted to meet their circumstances. Okay, so when we're looking at vulnerability and enforcement, obviously everything we do is governed by the TCE legislation. That legislation doesn't define vulnerability, and it also doesn't specify how long we need to give vulnerable individuals to find the support they need. We recognise the importance of an ethical and compassionate approach to enforcement, and we're continuing to work to ensure we communicate with people to find solutions. All our customer-facing colleagues receive specialised training to recognise vulnerable customers and how to address their vulnerability. All our enforcement agents are level 2 qualified, and that includes training to handle difficult and sensitive situations correctly. And furthermore, our EAs are not targeted solely on payment in full, whereas many self-employed EAs are. Instead, they're incentivised to find the right solution for the debtor, which could be a payment arrangement, or it could be a referral back to the client in cases of severe vulnerability. Our customer-facing colleagues are supported by our specialist welfare and safeguarding teams. They've had additional training to help them to support people who need it to engage with us and to reach a resolution, or to refer them on to more specialist help if needed. The work we do to support vulnerable individuals is vitally connected to the debt advice sector, and we hugely value their work and our ability to work with them. We have relationships in place already with a number of debt advice organisations, but we also know there's a lot more work to be done to connect people who need advice with the people who can provide it. We have regular meetings with several national debt advice providers to get feedback on our service to their clients and to stay in touch with their priorities and concerns in the enforcement industry. We're active participants in the national and regional chapters of the Money Advice Liaison Group, and that helps us to understand the ways we can best support our clients' customers and give the enforcement industry a voice in those conversations. I think that's really important, going back to something that David said, which is that it needs to be a two-way conversation. We need to be able to speak with the debt advice sector so that they fully understand what it is that we're doing. So to promote that, we regularly provide training to local branches of debt advice providers and independent advice agencies as well, to ensure that their advisors are fully confident in providing support to individuals who are facing enforcement action. These sessions are always really well received, and they help us to develop stronger connections, both between ourselves and the debt advice provider, but also between the debt advice provider and the end client, the local authority. Beyond this, during the pandemic, we supported several local advice agencies and citizens advice branches with donations of PPE to support them with continuing face-to-face provision. And we also advised others on digitising their interventions to help them provide remote support to their communities. Debt advice providers do a lot of great work, but there is more to be done in enabling greater networks of support across different regions. One of the limitations we keep coming across is that even where debt advice providers have great relationship with their local authority, this does not necessarily extend to all the local authorities they could be working with. And that can make it a bit of a postcode lottery as to the level of support that can be easily accessed. We're working on improving that by bringing groups together to discuss how the support they provide can be more easily spread across communities. So at this point, we have a roundtable discussion arranged for the East Midlands on the 14th of July, if anybody's got their diaries open, with input from 3 local authorities' welfare teams. And we've got another one in the works for the North West, which will feature 2 local authorities and their respective branches of citizens advice. We aim for these roundtables to be the starting point of discussions around how these relationships can be developed across the country. Aside from this, we understand there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about debt, especially PCN debt, about people who get into debt and the role of enforcement agencies in collecting that debt. So we're also working to advocate for education and communication, and we're striving to model the change we want to see in the industry. A really good example of this is our independent advice panel, which we formed 3 years ago to provide additional oversight and ensure we're always working to provide the best possible support to vulnerable debtors. Hearing Russell talk about the upcoming ECA is really exciting and kind of demonstrates why our independent advice panel was a necessary addition to our business model. So to finish off and to round out my time, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the biggest talking point in debtor vulnerability in the last few months, which is breathing space. The impact of breathing space on the parking industry has been really interesting. Our impression is that we would see much more cases for council tax than we would for PCNs. And the PCNs that we did see would most likely be an add-on to other cases. And in fact, we've not found that to be the case. A fair proportion of our breathing space cases have been purely PCN debt. And our sister company, Debt Recovery Plus, which specialises in private parking debt collection, have also received a higher number of cases than would have been indicated by PCN simply being an add-on. And that demonstrates the importance that vulnerability protocols have to PCN collection, and it emphasises the need for intelligent collection processes in relation to these debts. However, while we've seen a significant number of breathing space cases in the first few months of its implementation, it's still much lower than was predicted by lots of organisations ahead of the launch, similar to what David said. And it's still too early to tell the impact that's had on collection rates or returned cases, but we are monitoring that so that we can make sure that how we're using it is beneficial both to our clients' customers and to the clients themselves. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Any questions that you have, please do put them in the comments, and I'll be excited to answer those later in the panel section.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Helen. Yeah, I think we may well have quite a few questions coming in. I know I've been making some notes on questions with regards to vulnerable debtors, so hopefully we do get some questions coming into the comment section. So moving on now, we are going to be looking at quality assurance in enforcement training, and this is going to be led by Steve Penney, who is the head of learning and development at Marston Holdings.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. So my name's Steve Penney. I'm the head of learning and development over at Marston Holdings. I've been working for the company for about 6.5 years now, but 25 years or thereabouts in the education and learning sector, starting in secondary school education back in the mid-90s. So my responsibility now is to head up all the learning at Marston Holdings, whether that be for staff or the training that's offered to independent contractors. And what I wanted to talk today was really about the importance of quality assurance when it comes to 2 key roles in particular in the enforcement sector. so that of civil enforcement officers and of enforcement agents, both of whom, of course, are the public face of the enforcement process for parking and for debt recovery. And both these roles carry a weight of responsibility, not only to follow the legislative processes under which they work, but also to uphold the reputation on the name of those that they are representing. So for clients, the quality of the training is imperative to ensure that effective service delivery. But more often than not, clients don't have an awful lot of visibility on the process of creating that training or the methods used or the processes that are there to guarantee its efficacy. So a lot of trust has to be placed in training providers such as us to undertake those steps, to assume that they're taking place and to ensure that that quality of service is there. So I wanted to talk through today what that looks like and how training providers will go about doing that. So it's probably best for us just to start at the beginning of what some of those considerations when putting together training within the enforcement sector looks like. And I'll go through some of those key building blocks that we would look at when putting together a programme, but this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. There are many factors that we put together in terms of the considerations, but some of those key ones that we would look at would start with legislation, of course. So what are the laws that these roles work to? But also what's essential for that learner to know about. The laws are quite complex, they're quite extensive. Some of the legislation would apply more to back office processing than it would for on-street operations. So it's about getting that balance of what the field operatives need to know and understand about the legislation under which they are working. And then add on to that, you also have the specific requirements from each client that we work on behalf of. So once again, how do we ensure that those client requirements are met? How do we make sure they're understood by the learners? And again, making sure that they understand what their remit in terms of delivering those client requirements would be. We'd also look at due process. So us internally, how do we operate as a company? What values do we embed? How do we ensure that the training is in line with our internal processes? So what are the reporting lines if they need to flag vulnerability cases? Who do they go to report any kind of incidents to do with their health or risk or anything else? So how do we make sure that due process is embedded within that training as well? And three of those collectively could go towards forming the knowledge that's required for that role, which is then partnered with the skills that are required. But it's not as simple as just saying we need to embed those skills. So who defines what those skills are? How do they apply to each of the roles that we're looking at? And again, how do they embed the values to which we want to work? And that goes hand in hand once again with the behaviours that we expect a civil enforcement officer or an enforcement agent to display. And how do we benchmark those desirable behaviours and ensure that those are embedded throughout the training? Possibly one of the trickiest ones is scope. So how do we, where does the training begin and end? And I think this is a discussion that we have with most stakeholders when we're putting training pieces together. So as I alluded to earlier when we were talking about legislation, you know, it's not difficult to overwhelm or to overburden a learner with an awful lot of information up front. So for each particular learning intervention, how do we know what's relevant now? What would this person need to know now before they can begin working, and what can they learn as they go throughout their tenure? So we want to make sure that we've got that balance of scope right. And again, at the other end of the scale, we want to make sure that it's not too light, that it doesn't achieve its desired outcome. So getting that balance is very important. And we also talk about the appeal of the programme. So how do we ensure that the learners are engaged? How do we make sure that they want to participate in that programme? And why should they choose this particular learning intervention over any other? So again, lots of different other considerations that we would put there, but just wanted to bring these ones to come under that basic banner of the knowledge, skills and behaviours that we want people to display. And once that's been established, this is where the quality considerations need to come in. So first and foremost, like, how do we ensure that that learner has understood the learning and is able to apply what they've learnt? And that's key, because inclusion of a topic within a program isn't the end of the story. Just by simply having it there doesn't mean that what we're doing is effective, doesn't mean that the learner's actually understanding what's happening or is engaged with that particular topic. So we need that kind of quality assurance that the learning methods and the assessment methods are effective. We need to know that what we are training is correct, and this is an ongoing process. Never would we rest on our laurels and say, right, that's it, we've got it. We want to continually assess, engage with stakeholders to look at the programs and make sure that everything we're doing is correct. And for us at Marston Holdings, every time that we bring on a new trainer, we ask them to undertake that process as well, to look at all of our content with a fresh pair of eyes and to ask questions. How do we ensure that what's being trained is current and relevant? And never has that been more important than in the last 18 months. At Marston Holdings, we trained all of our agents in the protocols as outlined by Russell in his presentation earlier, but we did ours in-house. We've had the breathing space moratorium, so we need to make sure that we're keeping abreast of everything that's changing within the industry and ensuring that that programme is dynamic and is a moving feast, and that we're ensuring that everything is correct. We need to provide that assurance ultimately that the training is effective. There's no point putting together a training programme unless there are mechanisms in place to ensure its efficacy, which leads on to the next bullet point of how we measure that success, which is an important question to ask for any training provider of, how do you know that your training is successful? How can you show the steps to show that what you're training there works? And finally, how do we cater for those different learning styles and those different learning needs? So for every person that comes along, they're going to have their own wants and desires of how they're going to learn and the best methods for that, which can be challenging if you're trying to centralise a programme, but it needs to be a centralised programme that has a universal quality assurance, but still with that learner autonomy to be able to learn at their own pace in their own time to ensure that they still achieve those outcomes. So who needs that assurance? Well, first and foremost, it's the clients, the people that we're working on behalf of. And again, whilst we say that we will provide fully trained civil enforcement officers or fully trained enforcement agents, there still needs to be that assurance that that training is effective and that training works and that training is correct. We can talk about the customers, the general public, and while they may not consider or have any vested interest in the training per se, it is essential that they have faith that anyone undertaking these public-facing roles knows what they're doing, they understand the legislation under which they're working. We have our internal stakeholders, so we have our executive board, we have our operational divisions who want to know several things. They want to know that the training we're delivering does adhere to the values under which we work. They want to know that those are working under the correct operational models, and ultimately that they're going to achieve the service delivery that we have promised. We have external bodies, whether this be the debt advice sector, whether this be auditors, whether this be anybody that's looking at what we do and how we do it, to have that assurance. And many times we have invited third parties to come and view our training as an open book to sort of show what we're doing, how we're doing it, to provide that assurance there. And ultimately the awarding bodies. So any formal qualification or any accredited programme that carries the moniker of an awarding body will go through a very robust and rigorous quality assurance process. And by simply having that moniker of that awarding body, whether it be City Guilds or whoever else, does provide that reassurance to the remaining stakeholders just by having that this process has taken place. So just to briefly show you what that process might look like, and this is what any awarding body would, as a minimum, want to see in order for that programme or that qualification to carry that awarding body's name. So they will want evidence of a standardisation process, and that can be done through minutes of meetings or through evidence through an internal quality assessor or however else that will be presented. But in essence, what we're talking about there is ensuring that every trainer or tutor that delivers this programme imparts messages and topics in the same way, that they assess their students to the same standards, that there's no differentiation between the quality of service they'll get from one tutor to the next. So ensuring that that consistency is maintained, and more than just maintained, it's guaranteed. So we have to give evidence of that standardisation process. The quality assurance itself, so how do we ensure that all the content, as I mentioned before, is correct? How to ensure it's relevant, that it's effective, and that learners are actually achieving the learning outcomes that this particular training intervention aims to achieve. We must have a strict and robust version control process. So, we don't want trainers, having their own version of this training sitting on their desktops. There is a company approved, signed off program that must be adhered to, and that process needs to be evidenced to the awarding body to show that it is robust. Learners need to have some autonomy, well, not some, they need to have autonomy over that programme. So we need to instill formal processes for those learners to challenge any of the decisions regarding their assessments, or if they're unhappy with the way that it's being delivered, they need to know what steps they can take to show that they have their autonomy over their own learning. We need protocols and policies for equality of opportunity for learning, as well as provisions for those with specific learning needs, or those with cultural observance needs as well. We have to, most importantly of all, I suppose, benchmark assurance that the learning meets whichever framework or industry standards it's working towards. And finally, the analysis of the efficacy of that learning intervention. So how do we evidence that that learning is working and it does set out, or it does achieve what it set out to do? So in summary then, we're just to sort of bring together all these points. So civil enforcement officers, enforcement agents, those working in the enforcement sector represent not only their companies, but for which they're working or who they're representing, but also their clients as well. And the quality of service provision begins with the training that they receive. And it's important for all stakeholders to have faith and confidence in that quality and effectiveness of the training. And awarding bodies provide that reassurance to those stakeholders that the training has been through a robust quality assurance process, a very rigorous quality assurance process, and no awarding body would put their name to any training intervention or qualification that hasn't been through that. But similarly, I think it's important to point out that you are also able to ask any training provider yourselves what their quality assurance processes are, and it's important that those are in place to show that the training that is being delivered is being done so correctly, effectively, and appropriately. So again, thank you very much for your time today, and happy to gauge any questions you may have later.
Great stuff. Thank you very much for that, Steve. Yeah, I think that's a really important topic, really. When you're looking at those people that are out there and customer facing, and potentially having that kind of standardized level of training is really quite important. Moving on. Our next topic is detecting and deterring blue badge fraud, and this is hosted by Paul Slowey, sorry, Paul, who is the Director of BBFI Fraud Investigations. Over to you, Paul.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to allow me to present to you. It's an honour to talk about a subject that's close to my heart and has been for a number of years. BBFI was formed 13 years ago and is a non-for-profit organisation. Our constitution only allows us to work in partnership with government, be it local or central government, and registered social landlords, housing associations. I'm not controlling the slides, so I think I'm going to have to kind of wave or something to get them to. Thank you. We don't do any private work. We don't do any private client work. We were formed to increase compliance with the Blue Badge scheme and to increase compliance with social housing. We've got 20 staff, including an in-house solicitor, and we've got 17 investigators. About 50% of what we do is blue badge fraud investigation work. And in the last 12 months, we've prepared just under 1,000 cases. Thank you. I think it would be fair to say that there's been somewhat of a failure by local government to enforce the blue badge scheme and protect the rights of disabled motorists. The blue badge scheme was introduced 50 years ago, and after 50 years, according to Department of Transport figures, 48 English authorities have so far failed to produce a prosecution policy, let alone prosecute anyone. In terms of blue badge fraud, only 32 out of 159 authorities prosecuted 10 or more people. So only 20% of local authorities prosecuted 10 or more people last year. In huge swathes of the country, no one's ever been prosecuted for misusing a blue badge, and the scheme remains totally unenforced. It would be easy to point the blame at the feet of parking managers or even parking departments, but those departments are actually the financial victims of the crime and are not equipped to enforce the scheme. To use a lost, stolen, deceased or fake blue badge, or to misuse a blue badge, is a criminal offence, and it's either dealt with under the Fraud Act, the Road Traffic Act, or the Counterfeiting and Forgery Act. The investigation of the suspected misuse is governed by criminal legislation and not civil legislation. Primarily, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, the Criminal Justice Act, the Magistrates Courts Act, and the Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act. This is legislation that the corporate anti-fraud team within local authorities will be used to working with, and they'll work with that kind of legislation every day. But your parking enforcement teams have little, if any, awareness of that legislation. In some cases, local authority parking departments have set up specific in-house teams to tackle blue badge fraud, and they've gained a good working knowledge of the relevant legislation, and they've been very successful. But on the whole, blue badge fraud is enforced by corporate anti-fraud teams. Thank you. In 2019, BBFI carried out a survey of bay occupancy and blue badge use. This was published in Parking Review in early 2020, and I was actually staggered. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I was staggered by the number of blue badges in use in city centres. But firstly, I'll explain to you how we did the survey. We took 4 city centres in England and Wales, and we literally drew a circle around the city centre. And then over a 4-week period, we employed university students to visit those city centres on 3 occasions every week for 4 weeks, and literally go to each of the streets within the city centre and count the number of cars parked, and then count the number of cars parked with a blue badge. Now, we didn't take details of the blue badges, and we didn't take details of the registrations, so we didn't collect any personal data in doing this. But what we found was that bay occupancy, and we didn't have set times or set days to go. So the student who was collecting the data went 3 times during the day on different days of the week. And what we found is that bay occupancy was between 66 and 81%. You can see that there from A to D. But of course, we all know that bay occupancy at busy times is 100%. And we found the average, this is, bay usage was between 36 and 93%. if we move on, thank you. So the average badge use was 41%. If we look at somewhere like Bristol city centre, which was one of the ones we looked at, 49% of all vehicles, 49% of all vehicles parked in the centre of Bristol had a blue badge. Stunning. To me, that was absolutely shocking. Half the cars parked in the centre of Bristol have a blue badge. During the survey, we didn't quantify the potential cost or loss of revenue to blue badge use or to blue badge fraud. We just counted cars in streets. We didn't look at whether they were parked in pay and display bays, disabled bays, residence bays. So we didn't look at whether they were parked in revenue generating bays. We also didn't look at the cost in a pay and display bay. But that is something that individual local authorities might want to look at. They might want to look at their own city centres and say, well, you know, if we're like Bristol and 50% of the cars parked there have got a blue badge, what's the impact on our pay and display bays? The important thing is not necessarily the amount of usage, but the amount of misusage. And I'm going to move on. If we move to the next slide, this is just some compliance. Now, this is just figures I took from last month. So this is two authorities that we've been working in for a while. There were three things I looked at. I looked at the number of checks that we've done on the managed blue badges database. So this is a database where we can put the serial number of a badge into a database and we can check whether the badge is valid or cancelled. And what we can see in the first authority, we did 111 checks on the blue badge database. We physically checked 34 badges. That is, we approached the people, spoke to them, checked the badges. And of those 34, we seized 10. And in the second authority, we checked 362. We physically checked 41 and we seized 8. So what we've got there is we've got a compliance level in authority 1 of 70%, and then in authority 2 of 80%. So we've got a misuse level between 20 and 30%, which is massively significant. If 50% of the vehicles parked in your city centre have a badge, and 1 in 4 or just over 1 in 3 are misusing them and parking in a pay and display bay for free, or taking up a genuine disabled person's bay, that is absolutely significant to every authority. I suppose it's worth mentioning that when a badge is seized, we're seizing it under Section 19 of PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984. Once we've seized it, we don't have any powers to retain it. In fact, Section 22(1) of PACE says that if a photocopy will suffice, you've got no powers to retain an exhibit. Obviously, PACE isn't about blue badges, but it's about criminal investigation and the preparation of criminal cases. If we move on, thank you. Of the 33 authorities who actually prosecuted people last year for misusing badges, I've listed here the 15 highest. And what we can see there is that half of those work with BBFI, so we work in partnership with them. We've got a lot of experience. I mean, preparing 1,000 cases a year. We've got a lot of experience in case preparation. We've got our own solicitors, we've got our own administrators, and we manage that process and understand the legislation. I think if we move on and talk a little bit more about compliance, that would be great. Thank you. What we've got here, what I'm doing, I'm looking at 2 different authorities here. And again, this is information. I didn't look at this until I prepared for this presentation. So I'm looking at old data here. I'm looking at a 2012 to 2013 analysis of reason why a blue badge has been seized. So the first table there, we're looking at 259 badges seized in 2012, 2013, and 84% of those badges were seized because they were being misused. 4% of badges seized were stolen, 5% deceased, 7% fake. And what I've done is compared that to current data. So the data on the right-hand side is badges seized by reason in the same authority with the same investigator between February 19 and May 21. And there we've seized 42% of the badges seized were stolen and only 15% were misused. It's an authority where I work with the investigator sometimes. And what we found is that in 2012, 2013, we'd approach people and invariably they were using someone else's badge. So it was, grandfather's badge and he lives in a care home, or child's badge and they're at school. Now, when we approach people, they don't misuse badges. Compliance has gone up incredibly in terms of misuse. What we're now doing is we're finding a lot of stolen badges, lost badges, fake badges, deceased people's badges are being used in vehicles, invariably that are coming from other authorities into this authority in parking and being towed away and impounded, or the badges are being seized at the scene. I think there the message has got out to the local residents that if you misuse a badge, there's a real risk that you're going to go to court. It's a combination of an excellent publicity team, an excellent press team, and an excellent legal team within the authority. You've got a lot of press releases out. They prosecuted a lot of people. About 75% of that 250 were prosecuted. And they've got the message out that if you misuse a badge there, you've got a real risk of going to court. In terms of going to court, the average award is just under £500. So you don't really, you start prosecuting people and they're being ordered to pay just under £500. The message quite quickly gets out, not to use someone else's blue badge. So you can actually increase compliance. In terms of that huge number of stolen badges we're recovering, I think we are seeing a trend for more stolen badges, more lost badges. We're starting to see more deceased badges cropping up, but we're also better at detecting this stuff than we've been before. So we are recovering quite a lot. The next authority, Authority B in terms of compliance, if we move on. Fantastic. Authority B. This is data going back 10 years. So 10 years ago, half the badges that were seized there were badges that were seized from local residents of that authority. If we look at the data in the last 12 months, only 25% of the badges that were seized by residents of that authority. So again, the message has got out to the locals that if you misuse the badge, we are out there, we're going to seize the badge and we're going to prepare a case and prosecute. And again, it's costing them just under £500 if they get caught. So the message is clear, and compliance works, enforcement works, is the message. I think, another stat that's quite shocking here. We did some work with DM UK last year and their Baywatch survey. 95.6% of participants do not think that local authorities are doing enough to enforce the scheme. 95% don't think local authorities do enough to enforce the scheme. I don't know. I don't know what I say there. I think the next thing is in terms of the risk of being caught. I think I've already mentioned that some authorities have never actually enforced the scheme and don't have a policy, but the risk of being caught is 1 in 412. Very, very low risk. I think there's a problem for the whole industry in terms of issuing a penalty charge notice to someone who goes over on a pay and display bay, when at the same time there's a guy in the next bay with a stolen badge who's being ignored, and we'll get away with it. There's a kind of injustice to that I really think the industry needs to tackle, and whether they tackle that with in partnership with their own corporate fraud team, or whether they form their own team, or whether they work with BBFI, it doesn't really matter. The only way we're going to get compliance is with 100% enforcement of the scheme. Okay, can we move on? I mean, this again is, I've jumped ahead, but there's really 3 ways to enforce this, and it's with the parking, working with the corporate anti-fraud team, setting up a dedicated in-house team, or BBFI will work in partnership. And either way, it would be great to see those DFT figures with every authority initially having a policy of enforcing the scheme, and secondly, actually going out and seizing badges from people and prosecuting and publicising and increasing compliance. And that would be a great thing to see. Okay, all right. There's one more presentation after me, but if we move on, that's the end of me. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you very much for that, Paul. It's such an emotive topic. The abuse of blue badges, the abuse of accessible bays, things like that. It is so emotive. So I'm certain that we will get some really interesting questions following that. So any questions you do have, if you could please drop those in the comments for the question and answer session that we're going to have after this. So just moving on now to our last presentation. This is on ANPR vehicles. It's from Jonathan Hector, who's the business development at Videalert. Over to you, Jonathan.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm aware that I'm the last one, so hopefully, this is going to be interesting. I'm just going to pick my presentation. Here we go. So I've only got a few slides, so hopefully, I'm not going to make it too lengthy. So appreciate that I'm the last one running. So my name is Jonathan Hector, and I look after the mobile enforcement vehicles at Videalert Limited. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about ANPR vehicles. So a brief title to my slide, but I'm not going to dwell on that. Okay, so just to start off here, what are ANPR vehicles? Well, they used in lots of scenarios, but very basically vehicles with ANPR cameras mounted that I'm sure lots of people have seen around, used from everything from the police to civil enforcement duties. In the main, the basic function of an ANPR vehicle is that it allows you to collect data about parked vehicles from a moving vehicle. Fixed cameras that we're all used to collect data about moving vehicles from a fixed location. But if you flip it round, put the camera on a moving vehicle, you can then collect a lot of data about vehicles that are parked and where they're parked as well, which can then lend itself to lots of further activities. So just going back a bit, ANPR vehicles, or camera cars that a lot of people are used to calling them, first appeared probably in the late 2000s. Most of them had analog cameras and relied on manual capture from an operator within the vehicle. Also, the technology in those days was a little bit behind where we are now, and generally reliable capture could only be achieved with the vehicle traveling up to around about 20 miles per hour, which doesn't sound particularly efficient when using a vehicle. Things have moved on a lot now. We use digital cameras on the cars. They have a very accurate GPS system, and the ANPR, because of the digital cameras, the ANPR can collect accurate data with the vehicle traveling at up to 50 miles an hour. So on urban dual carriageways and such like, the vehicles are able to read number plates of vehicles parked in laybys while they're traveling through with the main traffic. The data interface with the cars now works over 4G, 5G as well. So obviously we have a much more improved communications with the vehicles as well. Now, in essence, the vehicles, if they pass a parked vehicle, they collect information about its VRM, time and date and latitude and longitude. And what that data allows you to do is to then build up data about where vehicles are parked and why. And the obvious benefit of this is finding vehicles that are parked where they shouldn't be. And that's so I'm just going to move on and talk about what we do in terms of automatic unattended enforcement, because from a parking point of view, this is the most useful thing that ANPR vehicles are used for these days. If you go back and look at enforcement of things like school keep clears, yellow zigzags outside schools, it used to be the fact the vehicle would park up and wait for somebody to stop, and then an operator would press a button and capture information. With the ANPR equipped vehicles that we have now, there's an example there in the picture in the top right. They're much more discreet these days. And the idea is that they will drive past the school. If, for example, there are 2 or 3 cars parked on the yellow zigzags outside the school, then as the vehicle drives past, it will capture that data and enough evidence for issue of a PCN to those parked vehicles. The ANPR vehicle doesn't have to stop. It doesn't have to interact in any way with the people on the street, and it's much safer for the local authority in terms of issuing tickets, and the traffic keeps moving and so on. All of these vehicles are programmed using desktop applications these days. So on the bottom left of the slide, you can see a mapping application where the boxes are drawn with the mouse around the zones that want to be enforced. What that then leads to is it enables the car to drive past the zone. When it's outside of the zones, the cameras are idle, they're not enforcing. When it goes into one of those zones, they begin to look for parked vehicles. And if they see one, the evidence is collected. And then when they come out of the zone, the cameras are switched off again. So it's a completely automated use of the vehicle to enforce and issue PCNs in locations where vehicles shouldn't be parked. Now, I must stress that 2 things on this. This application is only allowed in a location where a CEO might issue a ticket without an observation period. So school keep clears, white zigzags, bus stops, etc. Anywhere that the TRO allows instant ticket issue. And also the cases that are collected by the car are reviewed by a CEO in the office as well. So it's not as if the PCN goes from the car directly to the doorstep. There are several review steps in between. Moving on from that, more interestingly as well is where the vehicles are used for checking controlled parking zones. What I mean by controlled parking zone, residence parking permit, or even something like a station car park where you have, is it controlled in as much as cars are allowed to park there, some are not, and so on. So in this instance, what the vehicle can do can drive down a lengthy residential street, reading all the VRMs along the side of the road, and locate those that don't have a valid reason to be parked there. So the vehicles are normally connected to a server which contains a list of valid parking permits for that zone. That can include residence parking permits, but also cashless parking, such as roadside pay and display machines. If they are cashless and they include the VRM, then that data can be included again. So it maximizes the efficiency for the CEOs if they're faced with a large area of vehicles parked up where they're looking for the non-compliant vehicles. An ANPR vehicle can very quickly identify those and produce a list on the screen in the car of the VRMs and where they're parked, and also can show a picture of each one that it passed that was non-compliant. That data is all available to the CEO, so it makes his job much more efficient in terms of finding the non-compliance in what are usually quite large controlled parking zones. And then looking at my last slide about the other uses for the vehicles. So because these vehicles are collecting data about the location of vehicles, the survey capabilities of them are quite significant. So if you're faced with an area where you want to analyze the parking, the vehicles can drive around the area and give you a list of all the VRMs with latitudes and longitudes that are parked in that area. Once that's been done, the same survey can be done the following day, for example, and you can then tell whether the same cars are parking in there every day or if there's different cars parking there every day. Particularly, industrial estates that have problems with the amount of street parking. It's very interesting to find out if they are the same vehicles that are parking there every day, or whether it's just visitors that are parking there every day. DVLA enforcement, of course, the DVLA have a list of vehicles which don't have tax, which they are interested in finding out about. The vehicles can be fitted with a list of target, let's say, bandit vehicles that are being looked for. And then all the time they're driving around a city, they can be looking for a certain list of VRMs. And if they see one, they can flag it up to the driver and allow him to then do whatever he needs to do to identify that and inform the DVLA. Clean air zone monitoring is quite a hot topic at the moment. Certain cities such as Bath, where they have a clean air zone, can use the vehicles to patrol the city centre. The vehicles know the classification and VRMs of the vehicles that have permits and so on. There's always a ring of cameras around clean air zones to identify people going in and out, but there's always possibilities for vehicles to get past those, or perhaps they didn't get spotted. Also, vehicles that stay within the centre of the city for several days and just drive around and around, they're not going to be passing the perimeter cameras, whereas an ANPR vehicle that's driving around will soon find those and be able to take the appropriate action. And then surveys and video as well. The cameras on the ANPR cars also have colour video cameras, and that allows them to take colour video. So it allows councils to do ground truthing of bus lanes and certain roads and road markings to allow them to have a look at the quality of the street markings and street signage, because the ANPR vehicle can capture that video and then take it back to the desktop for analysis, which is much more preferable and much more efficient than somebody walking up and down the street having to take photographs and so on. And then NPR vehicles, as a final note, they're now being fitted with air quality monitoring as well. So because they're driving around local authorities doing this kind of monitoring, we can also take samples of air quality monitoring and noise analysis as well at various points around and provide that data back to the operator. So in a sense, the ANPR vehicles of today, they're very highly capable. They have very powerful computers fitted and very high resolution cameras. They lend themselves very nicely to enforcement, but actually there's a lot more uses that are now being given to them. From a data point of view, data is very useful to know where cars are and what they're doing and where they're parked and that kind of stuff. It's worth noting that they do only capture the VRM, so there isn't really any personal data captured by the NPR vehicles. There's no sort of keeper details or anything like that. It's purely a VRM with a time and a location. But that data is very useful to local authorities in terms of monitoring where the particular patterns of vehicle movements and where the non-compliant parking is within their authority. And that's me. I think I had a very short 10-minute presentation, so hopefully that was useful.
No, that's great, Jonathan. Thank you very much for that. So it's probably around about time that we bring this afternoon's kind of presenters back in. I have seen some questions flowing in. I think we've had a number of questions coming from Mark, but I think if we just kind of go right back up to the start, I think we earlier had a question from Gary Osner, which I think was looking at the ECA, the Enforcement Conduct Authority. So this is a question for you, please, Russell. And it's the question is, as with any independent regulator, the ECA will need to be funded. So how do you envisage that is going to be accomplished?
Yeah. So at the moment, the ECA is only working with CIVEA members for simplicity. But we're in conversation with the High Court enforcement guys and the independent civil enforcement agents as well. And CIVEA members have committed to funding the ECA on a pro rata basis. So the larger firms will obviously pay more than the smaller firms. So that has already been resolved. Obviously, the individual budgets is a kind of more of a technical matter that we've still to work through.
And can I just add something in with regards to the ECA? Is there looking to be any kind of input or representation from the government on that board from the outset, to actually kind of govern and see, how it's all going to grow and how things will progress?
Yeah, well, we're hoping that there will be an advisory panel to help the new CEO and chairman to get up and running, which we would like a government official to be involved in that. But the government is aware of what we're doing. They're supportive of what we're doing. They don't want to go as far as to sort of be directly involved through some sort of, by having putting into legislation at this point. So they would rather the industry went ahead and proved to the government that actually it can keep its own house in order, and the government only therefore needs to intervene if things aren't working as well as they should be.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, Russell. I have another question, but what I'm going to do is we'll go around. We'll give you a chance to just recover from the first questions. Thank you for that. I've got another question potentially for Helen and David with regards to vulnerable debtors. With obviously the stuff that's come in with breathing space and the vulnerable debtors, has it been difficult to potentially differentiate between those people who are genuinely in debt, and have you found that there are people who are maybe using some of the legislation now to actually just, whether that be to get debt reduced or written off, or just because they want a payment plan to defer it? How are you able to kind of pick the bones out of those two types of people?
Are you happy for me to start, David? So the first thing to say is that breathing space applications do have to come via a debt advice provider. So people can't call breathing space if we call them, or turn up on the doorstep. They can't just decide that they're in breathing space. It has to go through a money advice provider. And the second thing to say is that breathing space doesn't write off any debt. The only way you would write off debt is through access to an insolvency solution, which is the same as it was before. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who aren't going to try in some way to access protections that potentially they don't need. But what our sort of feeling about that is that the best they're getting is a 60-day delay. They're not getting. It's not getting written off. It's not going to go into a repayment plan if a money advice provider isn't identifying that there's more need there. So for us, we haven't really seen that as that much of a concern. And for us, it's more important that we are getting the help to the people that do need it than perhaps paying too much attention to the few individuals that might try and game the system. So I'm sure David's got lots of interesting things to add to that.
I'd say I agree totally with everything Helen said. I'd say as well, from a local authority point of view, how can I say we've heard everything? Our team, the way our team works is we allow the general public just to call us. We just have a phone number. So at any stage of the enforcement, our number's given out. So if a vehicle's clamped and an enforcement agency can phone the council. If they come through, if they get a refusal letter from the Traffic Enforcement Centre, they phone us. So we get people directly on the phone, and believe me, we've heard everything. In my years, people use anything to get out of a parking ticket. Some stuff, it's jaw-dropping, the reasons people give for why they don't pay. And I think because of that, we're already quite well equipped for sorting out what we think is genuine to what isn't. And like Helen says, it's like the breathing space gives people time. But we've seen that as well with things like when people file witness statements out of time. A lot of people do it simply to buy time. So I think from our experience in the team is we're quite well equipped anyway to see if someone is genuine or not. You know, we've always had that. So I think that even the initiatives, it's just something else people use. So it's something that we can identify. So in the past, if someone has brought an issue up that we've thought, hang on a minute, we want to see more evidence of this. To be honest with you, the initiatives are almost just more of the same. And we can just use a lot of our experience anyway to kind of differentiate what's going on and whether it is a genuine, someone's got a genuine need, or whether it is someone trying to play the system a little bit. Great
stuff. Thank you for that. I think we had a question from Mark, which was for Steve and Helen. Mark's asked, how important has the use of body cameras been in changing the behaviour of both frontline enforcement staff, but also the reaction of motorists on street or debtors in the home? Steve, did you want to take that one first?
Yeah, and I also noticed that Mike Mars has put his own comments in there about him being the record for the most assaulted EA with Marston, but he highlights a very, very key point in as much as, you know, the levels of safety and the visibility are obviously massively increased there. I think for our experience, I think that there was a divide between previous EAs and EAs coming into the industry after BWB was introduced. Initially, that was met with some skepticism from some EAs because of the reasoning behind it. And I think it's always down to communication of what the purpose of that body-worn video is going to be, what it's there to do, what it's there to protect, and ultimately it buys into the values of accountability and transparency and your own protection, so that, you know, any incident or any sort of occasion that happens has that visibility. But anybody new into the industry, this is now situation normal. So the use of body-worn video will be used as a conduit to embed those values into the training programs that we deliver. Similarly with the public and those that encounter that, you know, we would always put across, you know, whenever we announce that there's a use of video in place, of what the reason for that video is for. And most of the time, I think people are encouraged by that, to know that, you know, nothing is taking place, you know, secretly, that everything is out in front. But again, you know, there's some skepticism, and I suppose it all comes down to people's reasoning of why that mechanism is there. But ultimately, I think it does drive forward those behaviours that embed transparency, visibility, accountability, and ultimately, you know, safety. So it's had a very, very positive impact.
Anything to add to that, Helen?
Yeah, absolutely agree with what Steve's saying there. I think for us, we found it really, really valuable to be able to have that additional set of eyes that can then review anything, to contribute to things like training. So if there is a specific incident that arises or a specific stumbling block that people are coming across, then we can use that as a development tool. Not the video itself, but the learning from the video, to continue the professional development of everybody in the team. So what can be quite an isolated job actually becomes a really good community of learning in a way that wasn't possible before. So I definitely think that there's real benefits to the body-worn cameras, and I think that that's something that we're seeing real benefits from in our business, and I'm sure that's the same for all the different enforcement agents.
Great, and I think we touched on training again there, and I had a question really about the training, and mine was: do you think that there's any kind of there's a requirement, or should there be a requirement that there is almost like a national standard for training for an enforcement officer, in the same way that potentially, you know, a teacher has met certain standards, or a nurse or a social worker? You know, do you think that there is, you know, a requirement for that, rather than kind of, you know, almost that there is training, but some it can be done in-house and some it can be done through you know, a service provider? Maybe that's for Steve at the outset.
I mean, to some extent, that's already in place. So, you know, there are frameworks against which any training that, you know, within the enforcement industry work against already. And I think it's important. I think that's why I picked the topic of quality assurance, actually, because, you know, ultimately, no matter what training intervention is there, without that quality assurance process embedded in there to know what that efficacy of that training is and whether or not it meets those frameworks and those standards, then that's where it falls down. So I think we would welcome any kind of further regulation or further standardization of that, and we would respond accordingly as any other training provider would. But that's the mechanism that's important, and it actually highlighted the very reason why I chose the topic that I did today, to ensure that there is that faith in the training there, because all too often I think training is seen as, well, person A has done the job so they can train person B out on the street and that will be that, and there's no oversight or there's no assurance within that process. So those, I think, underpin any kind of standardization is having that kind of robust process in place. Yeah, okay. So just kind of moving on, Gary Osner had a question for you, Paul, and I've kind of got a question off the back of that. So Gary asked, do you see any value in restarting the qualifying process and changing the colour of the badges? They were orange before they were blue. And I think kind of my question kind of leading on from that is does the blue badge itself need to be looked at? Because it almost appears like the system is too easy to abuse.
Yeah, it is. Unless you put measures in place to actually enforce it. It is easy, but it's the same with, getting on a train. You can get on a train, you can go anywhere for free, unless you've got barriers in place and people to inspect the ticket. It's the same with a shop. You can walk into a shop and you can pick up your shopping and walk out, not pay, unless there are measures in place to actually enforce you to pay for your shopping. The blue badge scheme is exactly the same. If 40 odd authorities have no policy in place to enforce it, anyone who's got access to a badge can park for free. If 80% of authorities that we all work for do no enforcement of the blue badge scheme, it's a free-for-all. Anyone with access to a badge can park anywhere they want for free. And, the enforcement is the problem, and the lack of enforcement, and you're not going to get anywhere near compliance. In terms of the colour of the badge, not sure what the benefit of changing that would be. The badges are issued to an individual, not to a vehicle. I think that's probably the right thing to do. And the disabled person can use the badge. There's more and more data out there in terms of cancelled badges. What we need is every parking authority in the country to be checking those serial numbers. And if the badge is cancelled, taking action against it and recovering the badge. And what we need every authority to do is have a robust policy of enforcing the scheme. It's part of traffic management. If you're managing the public space, if you're managing the highway, and 50% of the cars parked have a blue badge, and you're not managing that, you're not really doing your job, is my response. Okay.
Yes, it's quite interesting because we've seen with parking management, the increase in things like cashless payments and the ability to pay using a mobile phone. And it's just obviously with the blue badge, it's still a very manual process, isn't it? Of the, setting it on the dashboard and things. It's just, is there a way in which that process could be adapted to make it less easy to misuse?
Yeah, I know exactly where you're going, Chris. I'd love there to be, to microchip disabled people is probably unacceptable. So the only way to do it is to physically inspect the badge, physically approach people. Quite a lot of what we get is leads from members of the public or from the civil enforcement officers who see things they're not happy with. And it's boots on the ground to go and investigate that. It is labour intensive. It is hard work. When someone's misusing a badge, they don't tend to put their hands up and admit it. They tend to give you a lot of waffle. That mother-in-law is in the hairdressers or whatever, or oh no, she's not in the hairdressers anymore. She's now moved around the corner, and it can end up with sort of half an hour of toing and froing. So it's not straightforward to do, and I'd love there to be an easy technical solution. You're absolutely right. The industry is moving forward with cashless parking and ANPR and all the rest of it. But the provision of parking for disabled people with a blue badge is a labour intensive process. And the only way I think that's going to change is with self-driving vehicles and possibly no longer a need for parking. And that's, you know, some way down the line, and then the blue badge scheme will change significantly. Yeah. Until then, no, we are stuck with physically inspecting badges.
Chris, could I just chip in here?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
At Videalert, we've been doing quite a lot of work with video analytics. We have cameras up lampposts that look at box junctions, things like that, and analyse where vehicles are going. So we've used our video analytics to have a look at the blue badge situation. And in actual fact, we've had some trial projects where you have bays outside supermarkets, for example, where we're using cameras and video analytics to actually have a look at the badge that's put in the dashboard, and potentially look at whether we can automate the process of checking that badge. The thing is, cameras are so good these days. The high resolution cameras that we use for enforcement are so good that we can actually read the text on the blue badge on the dashboard from a camera that's up a lamppost, you know, quite a way away. So we've been looking at how we might analyze that and automate it in some way. Obviously, it's reliant on lots of factors, like, for example, the car being the right way around. Apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently they do. I are obliged to park with the front of the vehicle into the bay, and then, you know, reliant on the fact that the badge is placed in a visible place. But then, you know, you could look at that and say, well, if the badge is not visible, then they should be getting a PCN anyway. But we can have a look at that. So I just wanted to say that, you know, we are looking in those sorts of areas to see if we can use camera technology to enforce.
There is a technical solution in terms of badges that have been cancelled, Jonathan. You're absolutely right. You could switch a badge off and on, and you could put that technology into the badge. So when a badge is reported stolen, for example, or lost, or the badge holder passes away, the badge could be switched off. And if that could be detected via a handheld device or by an ANPR camera, yes, in terms of a cancelled badge, there are things you could do. In terms of a valid badge, it's just a physical inspection. Yeah. Going up and approaching the person. Even if you can read the text on the front of the badge, you need to approach the person parking or returning to the vehicle. But cancelled badges, there's a lot more. One of the slides I showed, you know, 50% of the badges we recover in one authority are stolen, or I think it was 42% are stolen, and 7% are lost. Well, they've got a serial number on the front, and anyone who reads that serial number, who's got access to the database, can tell. And yeah, you could use technology to help with that situation for sure.
Brilliant, great stuff, great discussion. We've got another question, a question from Sharon Robinson for Russell. Will the ECA deal with complaints? If so, what stage will the ECA get involved? For example, High Court complaints should be addressed with the individual High Court companies and then escalated to the HCEOA.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Well, the policy will need to be sorted out by the people who are appointed to the ECA themselves. But the framework document proposes that, there is an adjudication process that comes in after firms have made their final decision. So taking the role of CIVEA and the other trade associations at the moment, and I've talked to Alan Smith about this as a potential thing, and he's sort of in principle in agreement with it. I think we all agree that it would be much better to have an entirely independent adjudication process for complaints, but only after they've already been investigated and a final decision's been made by the firm through their complaints process.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That it goes through those levels of investigation before it's got almost a hierarchy that it goes through. That makes sense to me. We've had another question from Andrew about an update on the mobile enforcement powers. I believe Mark has put some information on that in the chat, so I don't think we need to cover that during here now. We've got a question from Luke Normington. There are also schemes globally which are automating the likes of Uber and Lyft stickers at airport pickup drop-off zones for a similar use case. I'm not sure what that is related to. Sorry, Luke. I had just a couple of questions. Just for Helen, in your point, you said that kind of breathing space, you've shown high levels of actually people who were just asking for a breathing space purely for a PCN. I think you said that was the same for yourselves at Bristow and Sutor and for those guys over at Debt Recovery Plus. Do we think that maybe more needs to be done to actually educate the motorist at the point of parking? That idea of, it almost seems, or potentially that idea of maybe that they don't understand why it's important that there's parking management there, and potentially this idea of the deterrent effect of the parking charge or the penalty charge. If the deterrent effect is too low, there's maybe that idea that certain people might get multiple parking charges or penalty charges, and then it comes to a point where they've, it's just escalated and got out of hand. So I don't know, do you think there needs to be kind of more education to the motorist at the point where they park?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to be done around education to do with PCNs for parking and for moving traffic and all that kind of thing. I think there's a lot to be done around that. Potentially at the point of parking, potentially just as a sort of broader education campaign, awareness campaign, just because I think people have gotten to the point, and there's so much on the internet about avoiding these things that they've forgotten why they're there in the first place. And I think there's a lot that could be done around reminding people the importance of parking management and the importance of paying your charges if you do receive one. What I will just say is we're not seeing a lot of cases where it's for a PCN, like that's obviously not happening. But what we are potentially seeing is how vulnerability can affect people in parking by that some people are just getting to the point where they don't know how to cope with the number of PCNs they've received or the volume of posts they're getting, that kind of thing. So it's a really, really useful indicator of ways that we potentially need to flex the process. Because I do think that there's work that can be done to help people contribute to society in the same way that other people do. I don't think that it's a reason to not pursue a payment, but I think potentially there's work that can be done to make it more accessible for people to make those payments, or to understand why those payments are being charged against them. So yeah, I think there's a lot of education that could be done, and I think there's a lot of work that we could be doing to promote responsible parking to people who've forgotten what that means, really.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I just kind of looking down at the clock, I think that brings us to the end of our session today. I think just finally, I'd like to thank all of the speakers this afternoon. So thank you to Russell, to David, Helen, Steve, Paul, and Jonathan for your contributions. For me personally, it's been incredibly informative. Just a big thank you to Marston Holdings for sponsoring the event, for Mark and the team at Landor for putting the event on. Thank you all for attending. It just kind of it really does get you in the buzz for things opening up, and hopefully we'll get to meet in person at some point. Little plug maybe for the IPC annual conference in September in Milton Keynes. If anybody is interested in that, please drop me a line. But for now, I think that is it from me. That's it from the rest of the team. So I hope you've enjoyed this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed the day, and I'm sure we'll all catch up with everybody soon. So stay safe, take care. Hopefully see you soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.